The great Australian dream used to be a simple promise. Work hard, save your pennies, and one day, the keys to a quarter-acre block would be yours. Today, that dream feels more like a cruel mirage. In the glass-towered precincts of Sydney and the leafy, heritage-protected avenues of Melbourne, a different story is being written. While the average citizen scans real estate apps with a growing sense of dread, watching prices soar beyond their reach, a specific demographic, the top 1%, continues to accumulate high-value assets with surgical precision. It is the divide that defines modern Australia, a chasm not just of wealth, but of knowledge. To the uninitiated, the property market looks like a chaotic frenzy of auctions and rising interest rates. But to the elite, it is a chessboard where every move was planned years in advance. But this brings us to a fundamental truth that many realise too late. Wealth in the Australian property landscape isn't built by saving up for a deposit through a standard salary. That is the old way, the slow way, and often the losing way. The strategic investor doesn't wait for the market to give them an opening. They follow a specific set of blueprints, a hidden manual for asset accumulation that has been refined over decades. These blueprints are the reason why, even in a cost of living crisis, luxury properties change hands in total silence and portfolios grow even as the broader economy cools. It is a system built on leveraging structures and laws that the average person barely knows exist. On one side of this divide, we have the retail buyer. This is the amateur, the emotional participant who views a house as a home first and an asset second. They buy based on the feel of a kitchen, the light in a backyard, or the proximity to a park they might never visit. They are the ones bidding with their hearts, often pushing themselves to the brink of financial exhaustion in the heat of a Saturday afternoon auction. On the other side stands the strategic investor. They are cold, data-driven, and utterly logical. To them, a property is not a collection of bricks and mortar. It is a financial vehicle designed for tax optimization and capital growth. They don't look at the color of the walls. They look at the land-to-asset ratio, the zoning potential, and the demographic shifts of the surrounding suburb. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. These two groups are playing entirely different games. The retail buyer is playing a game of luck and timing, while the strategic investor is playing a game of systems. The blueprints they follow involve complex strategies that remain invisible to the public eye. We are talking about tax optimization through negative gearing, the use of family trusts to shield assets from litigation, and corporate structuring that allows for the kind of leverage that would make a bank manager sweat. It is also about invisible market access, the world of off-market deals where the best properties are snatched up before a sign is ever hammered into the front lawn. This is where the buyer's advocate, the shark of the industry, operates using relationship capital to ensure their elite clients get the first look at the finest opportunities. In this series, we pull back the curtain on these hidden mechanics. We will explore how Australian property became globally recognized as gold with a roof, attracting local titans and offshore investors seeking safe havens. We will examine the science of selecting A-grade assets and the mathematical certainty behind the 10-kilometre ring. But first, we must confront the most uncomfortable question of all. Most people believe that if they just work harder or save more, they will eventually win. But how can you win a game when you don't actually know the rules? Are you an active participant in your financial future or simply a pawn in someone else's blueprint? The reality of the Australian property market is that it is rigged, not by conspiracy, but by sophisticated rules designed for those who know how to navigate them. It is time to stop buying with emotion and start investing with a plan. To understand why the strategic investor wins today, we must look back at the foundation upon which this entire skyscraper of wealth was built. Australia's relationship with land has never been casual. It is a deep-seated cultural obsession, often described as the Great Australian Dream. Since the post-war era, the quarter-acre block became the ultimate symbol of stability. This wasn't just a house, and it was a sanctuary. For the retail buyer of yesteryear, this was a simple, linear goal. You worked, you saved, you bought. However, What began as a social ideal slowly mutated into a financial religion, creating a national psyche that views property as the only legitimate path to true prosperity. This cult of ownership laid the groundwork for a market where demand would always remain high, driven by an emotional necessity that the elite eventually learned to exploit. This cultural baseline provided the perfect fertile ground for a seismic shift in policy that occurred in the late 90s. Before 1999, property was largely a stable asset for the average worker. That changed forever when the federal government introduced significant adjustments to capital gains tax. By offering a 50% discount on capital gains for assets held for longer than a year, property was suddenly transformed into a high-performance financial vehicle. This was when the strategic investor was born. While the retail buyer continued to look for a home, the elite began to look for capital growth engines. The tax code sent a clear signal. Property is now the most efficient way to grow wealth with the government's blessing. It was a pivot point that ensured the wealthy would always have a head start, turning the market into a playground for portfolios. This policy shift was supercharged by the uniquely Australian implementation of negative gearing. While other nations allow for tax deductions on investment expenses, Australia's system allows the strategic investor to use the losses from a rental property to offset their personal income tax. In essence, the government began subsidising the debt of the wealthy. For the top 1%, this became their primary blueprint. They could buy high-value assets, let the tenant pay most of the mortgage, and let the taxman cover the rest annually.
It generously created a cycle, and where borrowing more actually reduced your tax burden. The retail buyer, often trapped in a cycle of paying off a non-deductible home loan, could only watch as the strategic investor used this loophole to outpace them. It wasn't just a tax break, it was a gated wealth accelerator. As these financial structures took hold, the physical landscape of Australia began to tighten. The country is vast, but its economic wealth is incredibly concentrated. The urban patterns in Sydney and Melbourne created locked markets that became the ultimate playgrounds for the elite. Because economic power focuses there, the land within them became a finite and precious commodity. Strategic investors recognized early that as the population grew, these inner city rings would become impenetrable fortresses of value.
They bought position, securing heritage-protected areas while the retail buyer was pushed to the urban fringes. This concentration of wealth created a geographic divide where those who owned in the inner rings saw their equity explode, while those outside struggled with longer commutes and stagnant growth. This scarcity, combined with Australia's stable political climate, eventually caught the eye of the global stage. Australian property earned its reputation as gold with a roof, a term describing the asset's safety. For offshore investors, the blueprints used by local titans were equally applicable. They saw a nation where property rights were absolute and demand was perpetually higher than supply. This international interest added a new layer of competition, driving prices beyond the reach of many local workers. Today,
and this historical foundation has created a self-fulfilling prophecy. The dream of the quarter-acre block has been replaced by the reality of a high-stakes financial game, and where the winners are those who understand that history is about the structural advantages that continue to define the present day. While the retail buyer is distracted by the scent of fresh paint and the sparkle of new stainless steel appliances, the strategic investor is looking at the ground. To the elite, a building is merely a depreciating box that sits atop the only thing that truly matters, the dirt. This is the first rule of the selection blueprint, the land-to-asset ratio. Wealthy Australians do not buy houses in the traditional sense. They buy land parcels with dwellings attached. And their goal is a mathematical threshold where the land value represents at least 70% of the total purchase price. They understand that while a kitchen starts aging the moment it is installed, a square meter of earth in a prime location only becomes more precious with time. By prioritizing land over the structure, they ensure their investment is tethered to a finite resource rather than a consumable good. This calculation is why they often ignore brand new developments on the city fringes, where the house might cost $400,000 and the land only $200,000. In that scenario, the investor is fighting a losing battle against building depreciation from day one. The location of that land is never a matter of guesswork. It is a science of proximity and human behavior.
The strategic investor follows the 10-kilometre ring rule with religious fervour. They look at the maps of Sydney and Melbourne and draw a circle around the central business district. Within this radius lies the economic heart of the nation, where the highest paying jobs and the most prestigious schools are concentrated. Historical data is their North Star, showing that properties within this inner circle consistently outperform the broader market during booms and remain resilient during busts. The retail buyer might be tempted by a sprawling 5-bedroom home 40 kilometres away, lured by the promise of more space. But the strategic investor knows that the market pays a massive premium for time. As the population grows and commutes become longer, the value of being close to the centre increases. They choose the small
and to a modest terrace in the inner ring, because they aren't buying bedrooms. They are buying elite access. Beyond the inner ring, the blueprint utilizes the ripple effect strategy to predict the next wave of capital growth. They track the movement of wealth as it overflows from established, high-priced suburbs into their more affordable neighbours. This isn't about hope. It's about identifying markers of gentrification before they become obvious. They watch for quiet signals like the renovation of a local park, the opening of a trendy high-end grocer, or a shift in the local council's zoning laws. They are looking for the tipping point where a suburb transitions from industrial to aspirational. By the time the retail buyer sees a suburb featured in a lifestyle magazine, the strategic investor has already moved in and secured the best A-grade assets and is waiting for the inevitable surge in demand to push their equity higher. This quest for growth is anchored in the concept of scarcity in character. The strategic investor has a profound aversion to anything that can be easily replicated. High-rise apartments are viewed as traps because supply can be increased at any time, devaluing existing holdings. Instead, the blueprint favors heritage-protected areas. When a street is protected by conservation orders, it means no more houses can be built there, and this creates a hard cap on supply in areas where demand is perpetually rising. This scarcity is further amplified by infrastructure arbitrage. So the elite study government planning documents to identify future train lines or hospital upgrades years before they are built. They buy where the government is about to spend billions, effectively letting the state improve the value of their private assets. They don't wait for the boom. They position themselves exactly where the boom has no choice but to happen. This is legal insider trading based on public but ignored data, ensuring their selection is always one step ahead. Once the strategic investor has identified the right patch of dirt, the next phase of the blueprint shifts from the physical to the financial. To the elite, a property is not just a building, it is a vehicle for capital, and the engine that drives that vehicle is debt. While the retail buyer is often paralyzed by the fear of owing money, the strategic investor views debt as the ultimate lever for wealth creation. And this is where the financial blueprint diverges sharply from the traditional path of saving and scraping. The first pillar of this strategy is the equity recycling method. The average Australian worker spends years, sometimes decades, trying to save $100,000 for a deposit. They trade their labor and their time for a stagnant pool of cash. The strategic investor understands that this is a losing race against inflation. Instead of saving cash, they manufacture it through the unrealized gains of their existing portfolio. When a property in the 10-kilometre ring increases in value, the strategic investor does not wait until they sell to realize that profit. They go back to the bank and have the asset revalued. If the property has grown by $200,000, they use that paper gain to secure a new loan, and effectively pulling out a deposit for their next purchase without touching a single cent of their salary. This allows them to scale at a speed that is mathematically impossible for someone relying on a savings account. By the time the retail buyer has saved enough for a second home, the strategic investor has already used their equity to buy their fourth or fifth. The structure of this ownership is never left to chance. Buying in a personal name is a rookie mistake that the elite avoid to protect their wealth from both the tax office and potential legal threats. This is the blueprint of corporate-style asset protection. High net worth individuals utilize family trusts to hold their properties. This creates a legal barrier between the individual and the asset. Because the individual does not technically own the property, the trust does, it becomes much harder for creditors or litigants to seize it. More importantly, the trust allows for tax optimization. In a country where the top marginal tax rate is high, the strategic investor can distribute the rental income from their properties to various family members who are in lower tax brackets. This effectively lowers the total tax bill of the household, keeping more capital within the family ecosystem to be reinvested. Beyond traditional trusts, the strategic investor looks toward their retirement savings as an active tool rather than a passive fund. The self managed super fund, or SMSF, is a cornerstone of the financial blueprint that the average employee often ignores.
While the retail buyer lets their superannuation sit in a corporate fund managed by strangers, the strategic investor takes direct control. They use their super balance to purchase high-growth property within a tax-sheltered environment. Inside an SMSF, rental income is taxed at a capped rate of only 15%, and if the property is held until the investor reaches retirement age, the capital gains tax can vanish entirely. This allows them to build a secondary property empire inside their retirement fund, utilizing a tax environment that is far more favorable than any individual could achieve on their own. Central to this entire financial operation is a radical philosophy regarding debt repayment. The retail buyer is culturally conditioned to pay off their mortgage as quickly as possible.
Viewing debt as a moral burden or a financial weight, the strategic investor sees it differently. They almost exclusively utilize interest-only loans for their investment properties. To them, the goal is not to own the property debt-free, but to control the asset while maintaining maximum cash flow. By only paying the interest, they ensure their monthly outgoings are kept to a minimum and their tax-deductible expenses are kept to a maximum. This frees up their capital to be funneled into other investments or to pay down the non-deductible debt on their own primary residence. They aren't trying to buy the house. They're trying to benefit from its appreciation while the bank provides 90% of the funding. However, the elite are also masters of risk management, avoiding the banker's handshake that traps so many amateurs.
The retail buyer often falls into the snare of cross-collateralization, where a lender links multiple properties together as security for a single loan. This seems convenient, but it hands total control to the bank. If one suburb underperforms, the bank can freeze the equity in the entire portfolio. The strategic investor avoids this by siloing their assets, often using different lenders for different properties. This ensures that every piece of their empire remains independent and liquid. By maintaining this separation, they ensure that while the retail buyer is tied to a single bank's whims, the strategic investor remains the architect of their own financial freedom, ready to pivot as the market shifts. But even with the most sophisticated financial structures in place,
the strategic investor knows that the true battleground isn't just in the bank's boardroom, it's in the streets where the deals are made. For the retail buyer, the search for a home begins and ends on public portals like realestate.com.au or Domain. They spend their weekends scrolling through filtered photos, attending crowded open homes, and competing with other emotional bidders. However, there is a hidden layer to the Australian property market that the general public rarely sees. This is the invisible market, a parallel universe of real estate where the most lucrative transactions take place in total silence. In the prestigious suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, it is estimated that up to 30% of luxury properties are sold off-market. These houses never see a for sale sign. They are never listed on a website.
And they never endure a public auction. Why would a seller choose to bypass the public eye? Privacy is a major factor for the wealthy, but for the strategic investor, this invisible market is a goldmine. By the time a property hits a public website, it has already been picked over by the elite. The retail buyer is essentially fighting for the leftovers. To gain access to this shadow market, the strategic investor employs a specific ally, the buyer's advocate, often known as the shark. While the retail buyer walks into an open house alone, vulnerable to a selling agent whose sole job is to drive the price up, the strategic investor sends in a professional predator. The shark's role is to neutralize the emotional leverage of the seller. They don't care about the color of the walls or the view from the balcony, so they care about the data and the deal. The true currency of the buyer's advocate is not just money, but relationship capital. In the tight-knit world of high-end real estate, the shark is on the speed dial of the country's top-selling agents. When a prime piece of land in the 10-kilometre ring is about to become available, the selling agent doesn't call a public list. They call the shark. They know the shark represents a strategic investor who has their financing already structured through a trust or SMSF and can move with surgical precision. This relationship ensures that the elite get the first look, the first negotiation, and often the final sale before the general public even knows the property was available. It is a closed loop of information that keeps the best assets within a specific circle of wealth.
Even when a property is found, the strategic investor does not rely on a standard building report. Their due diligence is an exhaustive dossier. While the retail buyer is checking if their sofa fits in the living room, the strategic investor is examining flight path noise projections for the next decade. They are looking at sewage and drainage plans to ensure the land can support future development or subdivision. They are scouring local council minutes for hidden zoning changes that could either block their view or allow for high density construction that would skyrocket the land's value. They look for quiet signals, a planned hospital upgrade or a new boutique school catchment that indicate a surge in future demand. To them, the property is a puzzle where every piece of data must fit perfectly before a single dollar is committed.
When on the rare occasion that a strategic investor decides to compete in the public arena of an auction, they do not show up with hope. They show up with a strategy of psychological warfare. The shark handles the bidding, using techniques to shut down competition instantly. They might start with a bold, high opening bid to signal infinite pockets, or wait until the very last second to deliver a knockout blow that demoralizes the retail buyer. They understand the psychology of the auction floor, the sweaty palms of the amateur, and the emotional attachment of the family looking for a forever home. By remaining clinical, the shark ensures that the strategic investor never pays an emotional premium. They buy with logic, leaving the retail buyer to overpay for the dream while the elite secure the asset at its true value.
You're just ready to move on to the final stage of the generational game. Once the keys are secured and the dust of the auction settles, the strategic investor initiates the most critical phase of the blueprint, the transition from acquisition to legacy. Unlike the retail buyer, who often views property as a 30-year debt to be liquidated at retirement, the elite operate on a buy and never sell philosophy. This is not merely a preference, it is a calculated tax avoidance strategy that shields wealth from the erosive power of the state. Every time a property is sold, the government claims a significant slice through capital gains tax, and the investor loses a portion of their compounding power to transaction costs. By holding the asset indefinitely within a family trust or a corporate structure, the strategic investor ensures the wealth leak never happens. Instead of selling to access cash, they simply borrow against the increased value of the property. This allows them to extract tax-free equity for their lifestyle or further investments without ever triggering a taxable event. It is a perpetual motion machine of wealth where the asset stays in the family for generations, growing larger and more powerful with every decade that passes. To truly understand the power of this blueprint, one must look at the mathematical divergence between the strategic investor and the average saver over a long timeline. If a retail buyer puts their money into a high-interest savings account, they are fighting an uphill battle against inflation and the taxman every single year. However, the strategic investor relies on the miracle of compounding interest applied to a leveraged asset. Over a 30-year horizon, a well-selected property in the 10-kilometer ring doesn't just grow linearly, it explodes. Because they use the bank's money to buy the asset, their actual return on invested capital is magnified 5 or 10 times over. A modest annual growth rate of 5% on $1 million property produces $50,000 in wealth in the first year alone, likely more than the retail buyer can save from their after-tax salary in that same period. By the time 3 decades have passed, the gap between the two is no longer a crack. It is a canyon that defines their entire quality of life. However, this relentless pursuit of the blueprint comes with a profound and heavy societal cost. The very strategies that make the strategic investor wealthy, negative gearing, capital gains tax discounts, and the concentration of land in urban hubs, are the same forces driving the Australian housing crisis. As the elite use their existing equity to outbid first home buyers, they effectively pull the ladder up behind them. The quarter-acre dream that once defined the Australian middle class is being systematically replaced by a permanent class of renters who pay the mortgages of the strategic investors. This is the uncomfortable truth of the blueprint. It is a game designed to reward the holder of capital and penalise the provider of labour. The wealth inequality being forged today in the suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne will likely echo through the next century, creating a landed gentry and a displaced working class. Can the average person replicate this? The answer is nuanced but hopeful. While the average worker may never have the speed dial access to off market luxury mansions or the multi-million dollar buffers to survive high interest cycles, the core principles of the blueprint remain accessible. Understanding the difference between bad debt used for consumption and good debt used for asset acquisition is the first step toward the elite circle. Learning to use equity recycling instead of saving for a second deposit, or choosing land-heavy assets over shiny new apartments, are moves that don't require a private bank. The barrier to entry isn't just money, it is the willingness to abandon the retail buyer mindset. It requires shifting from an emotional connection with a home to a clinical, data-driven connection with an asset. Ultimately, the secret blueprints of Australia's rich aren't about magic or luck. They're about a fundamental understanding of the rules of the game. The retail buyer is playing a game of survival, while the strategic investor is playing a game of math, law, and time. Education, rather than just working harder or saving more, is the only bridge across the divide. As the market continues to evolve and the gap between the haves and the have-nots widens, the choice becomes clear. You can either remain a spectator to the wealth of others or become the architect of your own. By looking past the shiny facades of the real estate portals and understanding the structures, the data, and the long-term vision of the elite, anyone can begin to rewrite their own financial future. The blueprint is there. The only question is whether you are ready to follow it.